Good evening, everyone, and welcome to today's class. So today we'll be looking at creating API routes in Next.js, but for today we'll be looking at the app format. Right, the last time we looked at the pages format and we were able to create API routes and do some actions, right? So I believe that already we understand the concept of having our API routes, like our server side, written within our Next.js application. So we created an application already previously that is an application, an app format application that utilizes the app folder structure. So we'll just go ahead and update that application to house our routes instead of calling our routes from an API, external API. Okay? Are we together? I hope you guys watched the last class. Like you went ahead and checked the last class to get acquainted. Okay, that's fine. I can do that. Is that okay? All right. Okay, let's get right into it. Okay. So, so first thing we'll do, we already understand the structure of our Next.js app folder. We have our API directory. We have our user directory where we are storing our pages, our user page, right? So we already created a user page the last time we utilized this application where we called APIs from the free JSON placeholder API. And then we displayed those users and had some other actions around those users, right? So what we'll do today is just build on that. So let's go ahead and start with creating a library folder. We utilize this library folder to store our user data. So let's go ahead and create a folder and call it data. And then we want to store our, we want to store our user data here. So we'll say users.js, and then we can create our user array. Export, let users equals to, but I want to have objects here. So we'll say, let's give an ID of 1. And then let's say name. Okay. So let's add email. Okay. For email, let's say John at gmail.com. Okay. We want to have some more rows. So Jane, let's have Jane at gmail.com. Okay. Let's have one more. That's the ID. 3. Okay. And then Bob, Jane, Bob, and John Doe. Okay. Are we together? So now that we have our user array created, right? We want to create our .env. So we already have a .env file here, which I created earlier. So for our .env file, our base URL will be the URL where we are accessing this application on the browser. Since it is housing both the server side and the client side. So we are going to be utilizing uh, the client side URL, okay, as our base URL. And then we can now access our routes, backend routes, our server routes via this URL. Now remember why we are using this. We are trying to expose this to the browser, right? Okay. So we can now go ahead and create our routes. Uh, Acknowledge if I'm too fast so that I can slow down or take what you don't understand again. Or I believe that this is something that you should understand, especially if you understand the last class. Okay. Yeah. So what we are doing here is just we are doing the same thing, but we are just doing it in a different way, right? It's like we have two paths and we are taking a different path to arrive at the same destination. So let's go ahead and create our first API route, okay? So for this API route, we want to have users. We have API, so we should have users as a directory. And then within our users directory, we want to create a file called routes, route.js, okay? Are you following? Now, within this route, something we need to import that I will need you to take note of is the next response. Okay. So we have next response from next server. Okay. Now, to help you understand what next response does, next response is a utility class provided by NextJS, right? Specifically for handling API routes and middleware. In the app, take note, it is utilized in the app format for API calls. Okay. So now let's say it's designed to work with web fetch API instead of the regular, like we're doing the last time, we're using response, request, and response, right? But in this case now, it's working directly with the fetch API. Okay. So now what happens is it handles all your API calls for you, right? So it handles your JSON response, sets your status codes, and modifies the headers, okay? And also handles redirect, all right? So there's a lot of methods a lot of ways you can utilize this next response within your API routing scenario, okay? So is that understood so that I don't go too far and then I have to come back? Do we understand what we are using next response for? Comments, please. Yeah, so okay, so you remember when we're handling the page directory, right? When we're creating the routes, we're accessing response and request, correct? So we're handling our response, handling our request, and then we're handling our JSON, we're converting our JSON manually, right? Within our yeah, we're converting our JSON manually. So, but in this case now, all that response request, converting your response to JSON and all that stuff is being handled by next response. Okay, so instead of doing rest.json, all we need to do is utilize next response to handle our application response. Okay, so I think you understand it better when you see it in action. Okay. Okay, so let's go ahead. Let's have a simple export async async function to call our to get our users data, okay? And then we want to return next response for JSON users. Okay. So let me further explain this. Think of next response as the modern response envelope you send back to the client. Do you understand? So it's just like how you might wrap a gift with wrapping paper and a note. Okay? The headers plus status. Next response lets you prepare the response nicely for delivery. Do you understand? So next response is like a packager, is packaging your response and making it very nice so that when you are delivering it to the client side, you get it differently than when you were getting it with the when you were using res.json. Okay? And it's particularly required within the app format for handling app format for Next.js. Okay? Hold on, guys. I just got light, so no chaos. So hold on, everyone. Give me a second. So you notice that every time I will create a route, I would use next response to package my response. So let's say export. So what this route does is it's supposed to get all the users, okay? So now if I say export async function, mm, function, and I say post request, okay? So now what happens within here is we can utilize this to handle our creation of users, okay? So const new user equals to, because we want them to have unique IDs, right? ID of date dot now dot to string, okay? And then we can now pass the name and email. So in this case, our user, we have name, age, and email, okay? I think we should just cut out email for now to avoid having too many data points if we decide to create a user, okay? All right, so let's work with name and email. All right, so from here, we should be able to push our new user. So we want to use dot push new user. So as you can see, we've not imported our user yet. So if we utilize this code, we should definitely have errors. But now we have our users imported, and you can see that everything is looking alive. Are we together now? Do we understand why we are using Next.js, next response? So we want to return next response dot JSON dot users. Okay. All right. So I believe we are supposed to return new users, and then we should have a status of 201 when it's successful. Okay. All right. So let's go. So now we have our routes to get user and to post a user, right? Like to create a user. We can go ahead and create our routes. Should we utilize these routes first before creating other routes? Comments, please, to avoid getting you confused. No comments. Okay, okay. I thought so too. All right, so let's go ahead and utilize these routes before we uh see what next. Okay. So what we'll do now is to create a helper file within our utils. So let's have a helper.js. So now what we are trying to do now is we are trying to now make API calls on the server side. Okay. So we have our API done on the sorry, make API calls on the user side, on the uh, client side. So now we want to access that API to get those users that we created, these dummy users, right? So if we come to helper, we can create, export, async function, get users. But you don't need props. You don't need any parameters. Then we can say const equals to response dot await fetch. So we are fetching from our API users. Okay. So what this should do now is return response.json. Okay. So if I save this and then we go ahead and test out our get user, which we already did here. So I believe we have a get user endpoint already here. So get users, let's from helper. So this, okay, hold on, guys. Let's keep this out so that we can visualize our code, okay? All right, so I think this should work now without throwing any errors. Okay, so let's go back here and so that next response is in the backend. That's inside your API. We use that to create our routes. Okay, so we are packaging our response here to deliver to the front end. Then over here, we are now processing that response that you are sending from the backend. Do you understand, Josh? Do you understand? Yeah, so routes for getting users. So this get users. Hold on, let me just remove this. Let's fetch this again. So when you say the route should change, what route are you talking about? Hold on. Yeah, so we already changed that route when we're calling the API within our helper, as you can see. So before now, we would have utilized the how do you call it? We would have utilized the JSON placeholder API here, right, to get users. But now we are getting users directly from this route, this API route that we've created, which is this. So if you remember the last time when we worked with the pages, we did not separate all these requests. That's we did not separate all these methods. We utilized one handler to construct these methods. Okay. But now we are all these methods have to be called independently for them to be seen in the app structure. Okay. So what we have done now is created an API route, which is API/users. And then we have utilized our API route here to say we want to get users based on this route. Now, those users are stored in our dummy database here. Okay. Now, when we trigger this get users within our page, which is what we are using this use effect to do, right? So we are getting users and then we are setting the content of users to our user state. Then we can access it by checking the console, okay? So the get user I'm importing is coming from the utils folder, the helper folder. This is what I just imported. So remember that when I'm working with app, I always like to outsource my API handling to a helper function, to a helper file, where I handle all my API calls and just utilize those API calls within the component instead of calling the API directly inside my component. I'm sure you would have noticed that by now. I even explained it, I think, in the class before the last class. So it is that get user that I am importing from utils.helper/helper, right? Now, if we go ahead and look at our code, we should be able to see our users, okay? So if we also check the console, because I utilize the console there, so if we look at the console, we should be able to also visualize our users here. Okay, so we have John, we have Jane, and we have Bob. Okay, because we have not created our route to see these users based on each ID, we cannot access the view for now. If we go to view, we should have an error. Okay, now let's go back and create other routes so that we can move. Are we together? All right, so moving back here now, all we need to do to create our next route, that is, assuming we want to have a route to delete, update, and probably get by ID, right? We can now create a dynamic route over here, okay? Now for a dynamic route, we are going to create a directory and call it ID. And then within that directory, we are going to create a file and call it route.js, okay? Now all we need to do is import our next response. Okay, and then we can easily export our async function to get users by ID. So we can now say get, and then for get, we want to have, since we're passing params, we can have requests, and then we want to utilize the params to see which user we are getting at the time based on the ID that we pass, right? Which will serve as the params. Okay, so let me see your questions. Why, please? I need to understand why the routes are created in different files. I thought the dynamic routes would be created directly inside the app router. No, that's not the case. So I don't know if you have noticed that we are not working with the pages anymore. So I said this when we started the class. Were you guys not early? I say we are not working with the app routing method anymore. This is not with the page routing format anymore. We're working with the app routing format, which works pretty much differently. Okay. And I think I explained that already. So maybe if you go back and watch the videos, you will see the differences between what we are doing here and what we did with the pages. Okay. So I've done all this with the pages, so I won't come and I won't do the same thing again with the pages. So try to be open-minded and remove the pages that you've learned first from your mind and focus on understanding what we are doing here. This is a different pattern of handling what we did in the last class. Okay? So don't get yourself confused. It's not that deep. It's just normal stuff. Like it's about the same thing that we did in the last class, but this time we are doing it not in the pages format, but in the app routing format. Okay. Now for the app routing format, these routes are very important. Yes, of course. So let's assume that, let me understand what you mean by different folders. So if maybe it's the folder structure that is disturbing you. Let's say products. Do you see now there is one folder? Please, I need your response so that we can move on. Yes, unmute.
Okay, sir. Can you hear me?
Mhm.
Good evening.
Yeah, carry on.
Okay, please, I beg you. You know, in the pages, you created get and um, put in, sorry, get and put in a particular folder in the index, which you later changed to user.js. Then
Mhm.
you now came and created get, put, and delete in another
The,
folder. I didn't understand that in the pages. I was like, wait, after this class, I was going to ask, but you're almost doing the same thing again here. So that's why I said I needed to understand why they are being created in different folders.
yeah, so this your question now makes me feel like you don't understand anything we've been doing since. So when I ask, what do you, are you following? Are you following? And nobody responds. Well, how do you expect me to feel about that? Because now you're asking a question that is fundamental. I already explained this stuff before. How
You
do
know,
we
sir, in that class, I told
not,
you I didn't
not
understand, but I was going to go to the video and check instead of dragging people back.
yeah, hold on. Sometimes that too, the issue is coming to class early. Now, what I explained initially, what do you understand by how we are routing in Next.js? Folder based, correct? Please.
Yes, yes, folder based. Yes.
And then how do you understand dynamic routing? Let's
Wow.
don't look
Dynamic routing is got
at
to do with, I
yeah,
know it's got
so
to do with the with a
hello.
particular user.
Yeah. So hello. Forget about the APIs now. Let's work with the pages that we created. That is static pages, front end pages. How have we been handling, that is these pages here. How have we been handling dynamic routing?
We create an ID and then
Okay.
create pages inside it and then
Yeah.
route it based on the folders, user stroke the ID.
Good. So for that explanation that you just gave now, explain what's happening within this folder too.
Okay, maybe the route.js is what is now confusing me. But what I'm asking now is why are you um
Because the route is
creating
dynamic,
the methods, the
because the
get
route,
methods and all that? You know, these are things.
listen, sometimes listen, because the
Okay,
route is dynamic. Now, if you look at these routes over here, these routes have nothing to do with IDs. It has nothing to do with personal data. Now,
got
this
it.
particular route here has everything to do with all the users in the system. We want to get all the users in the system. So there's nothing personal within the user. So we're not looking at dynamic here. Okay. Now, when you
Mm.
come to post, the idea of post, you are not posting into another user, you are creating a fresh user. So not personal too. Okay. But once you start thinking of get by ID, are you following me? Once you start thinking
Yes.
about get by ID, you are thinking you want to get one person. That's personal. Dynamic, you want to get one person. You want to access a particular person's information. Let's leave persons, let's assume it's a product. You want to dynamically see the details of a particular product. Now,
Mm.
that is when you start talking about delete. You cannot delete, if you want to delete now, except you have a particular, let's say you want to create a route that can delete the whole database. Then you can have it in a location like this where it has nothing to do with dynamic access to particular users. Okay. But once you start thinking about deleting one user from a bunch of users, you are considering dynamic. So you are thinking, how do I access those users? You want to access them based on their ID because that's probably going to be like the most unique. Okay, it is probably going to be the most, depending on how you structure your data or your back end guy, or if you're the one writing it, has structured your database, right? There is
Mm.
a 90% chance that your most unique trait for each user will be the ID, which is what we are assessing these users by creating these separate folders that's supposed to dynamically assess those users' parameters so that we can utilize it to make API calls that are tailored to those users.
Got it. Thank you.
Is there
Sorry
anybody
to have
still
pulled you
lacking?
back.
Is anybody still lacking behind in this explanation? I will be very glad to take it again because I would not like to take it again. later. Anybody, please feel free. We're already on it, so let's just get it out of the way. And please, if you don't understand something, except you are late for class, if you are early for class and you're following me and you get stuck, it's easy for me to re-explain those things, right? But if you come late, I cannot go back to explain because you are bringing the whole class backward, whereas we have a standard time for these classes. Okay? So, Udo, I believe you are good. Michelle, are you following?
Yes, I'm following. Good evening.
Good evening. Dave, are we together? And Josh, is Josh still with us? Greg, are you following? I know you came late. All right, okay. So we can move forward. Is that unanimous? Please, in the text box, respond. Okay, all right. So what we are doing here now is we are trying to assess these users dynamically, right? So first thing we want to do is we want to be able to call these users, like get these users based on their ID so that we can have we can display in our dynamic routes where we are trying to view more details about our users. Okay. So we assess the params and then we can now const user equals to users dot find. So let's import our users before we continue. All right. Dot find user dot ID, where user dot ID is equals to ID. Okay. Now we can go ahead and add our failsafe, avoid errors. So if user is false, we want to return next response. Let's say JSON, and then we want to have some error messages. Let's say error was to not found. So we can modify this to say user not found. So what this class is supposed to do for you is help you understand what the backend guys are doing so that when working with backend, it's pretty much very easy for you to adapt to whatever they are sending. And it's easy also to request for what you need. Okay? Because sometimes a backend developer might deliver data in a particular way that probably the way you structured it in your front end is not what you want. You want to be able to understand the things that are happening at the back end so that you can then, okay, see how I want my response to be. Can you make this, if the person is missing the response code or status code, can you make it so and so status code so that it's consistent, so that I understand the response, I can tell easily when I'm getting a failed response, you know? Those are things that you want to understand, which is where this class comes in. So I believe we are on track with achieving that, right? Are we on track? All right, so we say export async. So now we have our API route to get users by ID, right? So we want to see how we can delete users, based on ID. Okay. Definitely params, and then we can close this and write our logic. So yes, and I want to say const index equals to user dot find index of user. Yes, okay. Then we can if index equals to -1, return next response. And then let's have our error that says not found. Either not found. Okay. And then let's attach our status of 404. Okay. Now we can go ahead and handle our delete. Okay. Then return our response. So new next response null, then status 204. Okay. Okay, so now we have a route to handle delete. Okay, so we can go ahead and test out or create other routes. Should we stop with this one? Okay, yeah, let's stop here. Let's go ahead and explore these routes, okay? So first things first, remember we are going to create our handlers inside our helper functions, inside our helper file. So for that, we want to have an export async that handles fetching users by ID. Okay, so say get users by ID, and that should be ID. Then we can now have our const, and for this we are going to utilize our base URL. Okay, so we can pass it directly, but let's just call it separately. Let's define it separately. And for our base URL, we'll access it using process.env dot next public base URL. Okay, so we can still add the base URL defaults to avoid any issues if it doesn't access it. Okay, then we can now go ahead and make our API call. So I'll tell you why we had to make this, how we have to bring this, access this public base URL. So let's say await fetch. So for our fetch, we have this, and then we can now call our base URL inside here. Then API slash users slash ID. Is this confusing to anybody so that I can clarify what's happening here? Return response dot JSON. Is anybody confused? Yeah, Josh, you said implement, so I don't understand what you're talking about. Okay, go ahead, Udo, raise your hand. Or unmute your mic rather.
Hello, sir. I thought that the
Mm-mm. I think your network has.
API stroke user is the
Mm,
same as the base URL because the base URL, I thought the base URL was created on. Wait, man, you can't hear me? Hello?
yeah, I can hear you now. So let me explain the base URL quickly again for the benefit of everybody. This is where we saved our base URL, which is the localhost.this, right? Now, to access this base URL, we have to utilize the process. This is how we access process.env. So we are checking the env file to access our next public base URL, which we have already created. Yeah, okay, no problem. Okay, so what we are doing here now is when you talk about base URL, you are talking about the actual URL that you are picking your API from. Now, the URL is at the moment, this is our base URL. Our base URL is localhost 3000, right? And you can see our routes. So this is localhost 3000 and the route is users. Okay? That is the API route is users. Now, for this particular dynamic page, the API route will be users slash IDs plus our base URL. Now, we can attach this same base URL to this to have the same call, which is actually the ideal thing to do, right? So we should actually add this base URL to this API call, but it will not be problematic here, okay? It will not be problematic there because you are not trying to use params here, okay? Now, in this case, now it will be problematic if we don't access the public URL because you are trying to access the params ID in an async component, okay? Basically in the app router, that is where it can be problematic, right? But the server side is not going to see this route here from our browser. Are you following? The server side is not going to recognize this route from our browser because it's not accessible to it, okay? So all we need to do now is expose that URL, this base URL. We need to expose that URL so that we can now access, this fetch will now see based on, will now be able to access the params of that particular page, of that dynamic page, to pick the ID and then utilize it to run this API call. Is that clear? Is that clear? Okay, all right. Udo, you asked the question, so are you clear? Okay, so let me help you out. So another thing, let me put it this way. This URL here is relative. So inside the browser, it will work perfectly well. Like it will access the routes and everything, and your code base will access this route inside the browser. But when you talk about the server side, okay, the server side functions will not access this particular route except you expose it in your env, in your environment variables. So when you exposing this environment variable is like giving your API call access to see the URL that you are utilizing to call the API to make the API call. So now the server side is not going to try to see what is happening here. All it's going to do now is it's going to be accessing that route from here. Now, understand that why we're having this issue is because we want to access a dynamic route. Now, for us to access that dynamic route, we have to be able to see this, we have to be able to get this ID from this URL. In order for us to get this ID from this URL, we need to expose that URL to our server-side application. So we need to expose that URL to this API call, so that it can now see the application that it is trying to make the API call from. Remember that this backend, this URL here is the same URL we are using for frontend and backend right now. Okay, we're using the same URL for backend and frontend, and then we are exchanging information between between server side and client side. Now, in that exchange, we want to show or utilize the client side ID on the page that we are going to route to. We want to pick that ID from the params. Now, for us to access that ID in the params, we need to expose this URL here so that the server side can run. Do you understand now? Okay, all right, excellent. So when we do this now, it's easy for us to now utilize our server to handle this view that we are trying to display. Yeah. Okay. All right. Thank you. So let's go ahead and add one more. Let's add one more case. So let's handle delete. Yeah. Export async function delete user. Okay, and then definitely by ID, and then we want to non-const response equals await fetch. Okay, and then the method will be delete. And then we can close that, and then we'll say if response that okay should throw an error. Should throw an error failed, then delete user. Okay. All right, then we can also have our if. We'll say if response dot status is equals to 204. We want to return no. Okay. And then we can now return our response. All right. Are we together? So it's just delete function that we created. Now remember that we already have most of these actions created in our pages, right? So we can just go ahead and test them out. I think first thing we'll do is to return our handle delete function and then import our helper API call. And then we can now return our delete button. Okay. Then we can go to our pages dynamic page and then we can import our get user by ID. And then, yeah, I think that should be it for now. Okay, so if we save this and we come here, we should be able to. So let's come from scratch. Okay. All right, so let's experience this from scratch, okay? Okay, so now that we have some errors, we can look at that on our own. Okay. Give me a second, guys. Okay. So I'm not so comfortable with the error we're having here, so I want to see why this is happening. Mm. Okay, so let's ignore it. So we have internal server error of 500, internal server error, which means something is wrong with our code. So we are actually assessing hitting our endpoint, but we're having an error. Okay, so let's see where. Hold on. Okay. So I've not removed anything. Get here. Where? Helper 16. You can't see. Can you see my screen? No, I'm here. I'm right here. I'm right here. I'm having a book. So, okay. Okay. All right. Forgive me. Let's carry on. So I need to bring back our delete function. Now we can go ahead and test. Okay. Let's save this and then let's check our helper again. Okay, we brought it back. All right, so we have our delete button and we have our view. So if we go to view, we should be able to visualize details of our users. So as you can see, we have John Doe and we have john@gmail.com. So if we go back, we can visualize Bob Jane. Likewise, we can also visualize Jane Bob, okay? Now we can also delete these users, okay? All right, so for the adding of the user, it's probably going to appear in your tag. So pretty much just repeating what we've done before. Just in this case, just utilize the pattern now to handle it because the task I'm going to drop now is going to require you working with this app pattern of creating API routes, okay? So I believe that so far we've been able to cover this to a good extent. And ideally, so if I shut this down and start it up again, we should be able to see all our users again. Okay, all right. So what you guys need to look at, go back and I think we did adding users in the page directory method. So this thing is just still JavaScript. So basically just writing your logic and handling your API calls. But for for simplicity, I made sure I followed some kind of structural best practices to help you see how you can structure your code to avoid confusion, right? Consider you have your API folder, you have your library, you have your user, you have your utils, right? Inside utils, I can also make my image importations in one place so that when I'm using my images, all I need to do is import my images from a particular file under utils, right? Globally, and I can just easily access those images, especially if I get the opportunity to name my images and I can call them anywhere I want within the application directly from my utils folder. Okay. Uh, Now your users folder, you can see, as you can see, you have the main page, and then for dynamic routing, you have your dynamic page, right? Now you have your library where I've saved a library of users, okay? And then we have our API folder, API directory where we have our user backend server-side routes. So we defined our routes for general use, on the user's table, on the user's data. And then we also defined routes for individual usage, right? On the user um, data. Okay, so we use this to manipulate each user, and then we use this to manipulate the whole user array. Okay, and that will bring us to the close of this class. So basically, if you are handling products too, you know that you want to have a product route. Let's say you want to create a route where you want to have products called from, right? You are definitely going to have a product route, and then probably for them to be able to view more details about those products, you want to have like an ID, a dynamic route for dynamic manipulation of your data. Are we together? Now you can go ahead and utilize Firebase to set up like a mini database so that you can explore utilizing an external database instead of calling your database, utilizing your database from here, right? So you can go ahead and also try to explore that with your backend routes. Thank you, everyone. I believe we're all together in this class. Did we follow? Are we good? So Udo is saying, Udo, I thought you already understood all these things. Like from my explanation, you sounded really confident. What's the challenge, please? Or meet yourself. Okay, the Firebase as of when we introduced Firebase initially for you to utilize for your tax, we're not scared. But you are way past that stage now. Now you utilize Firebase and you are running right now. You hit the ground running. Yeah, yeah, definitely. You're welcome to rewatch the class. So feel free to watch the class again. Can watch it as many times as possible to like grasp everything. Luckily for some people who I'm sure were not also clear, Udo was able to ask some questions that made us go back to like get more clarity. So yeah, that's still good. Yeah, I don't know. I can't promise. I can't promise, but it will drop. If it doesn't this night, probably tomorrow morning. So just look out for it. Your tax should drop today. Probably after this class, I'm going to drop your tax for the next stage. So yeah, thank you everyone for joining today's class, and I look forward to seeing you guys in our next class. For those who are still having challenges with their tax, please reach out to your class heads, see how they can help you, reach out to your colleagues. A lot of people have passed, asked questions, who has completed this task, who has been promoted. Okay, this is the challenge I'm facing. How can you help us? You know, yeah, it's very important. Yeah, Odo, you're welcome. It's very important. That way you don't get left behind. Everybody's here to help you. Okay. So feel free to reach out to me too. If I have the chance, I will definitely try to assist you, or I will delegate somebody that I'm very sure is in a good position to help you and give you that room. Yeah, so you watch our previous classes, Excel. We already did the UI a long time ago. So this was just creating API routes and replacing the API routes with the free API route that we got from Jason. Yeah, thank you everyone and have a great evening. See you guys in our next class. Bye.